Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Dr. Elizabeth Cotton is Associate Professor of Responsible Business at the University of Leicester and the founder of Surviving Work, which carries out socially engaged research on mental health and work. She has worked with health teams and trade unions, practiced as a psychotherapist in the NHS, and now runs the Digital Therapy Project, a group of UK and US researchers studying the future of therapy from both sides of that relationship. In her new book, UberTherapy, The New Business of Mental Health, she explores the effects of reorganizing mental health care around the logic of the App Store. So, therapy is now something you can scroll through on your phone or match with in seconds, rate like a rideshare. These platforms promise frictionless access and personalized care, but what's harder to see is how this new mental health marketplace is reshaping what therapy is and how it feels and who it is even really built to serve. She traces how public austerity and platform capitalism have combined to turn mental health care into a set of digital products governed by algorithms, data extraction, and even dynamic pricing. In this world, qualified human therapists are slowly being displaced by AI driven solutions, while those who do remain are pushed into precarious, low paid platform work. Uber therapy is part political economy, part insider account of therapy work, and part literary exploration of what it actually feels like to bring our most distressed versions of ourselves into these mental health apps. In our conversation, we talk about the politics and business of digital mental health, the lived and embodied experience of being both therapist and patient in this landscape, and the forms of solidarity and resistance that might actually help us protect the conditions for real therapy in this digital world. So, Dr. Cotton, thank you so much for joining us on the Mad in America podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you, Justin. And thanks for actually reading my book. And I look forward to talking to you about it.
It was a pleasure. I'm glad I did. So I really want to get into the details about what's happening in the digitalization of therapy. But part of what makes this book so illuminating and unique is that you're able to speak to this issue from many vantage points. You're a professor of responsible business, a labor organizer, an activist, a sociologist, a therapist, a patient. So maybe the best place for us to start to situate our readers is with you. Can you briefly situate yourself for our readers? Who are you? How do your various experiences make this particular book possible?
Well, I'm quite old. I'm ancient, in fact. So I have a lot of experiences of working life and experiences of psychotherapy. It means lots of different things to me. I'm going to tell you some personal things about me, about what really has formed my character and my interest and my politics. I now live back in the place where I was born in rural Britain, in the countryside, in the Cotswolds. And when I was growing up, it was a really depressed and poor bit of the world. Now it's like the Florida of the UK, and we have Beyonce living here. It was not like this when I was a child. But I'm a twin. I'm an identical twin, and that really shaped me as a person, both in a great way, I think, in that from a very early age, I had somebody who really understood me and who really saw me, which is an incredible privilege for a young person to have. But we were also quite weird and quite smart young girls, and we used to wear dressing up to school. So at a very early stage, we were bullied and we were considered quite strange. And in the 1970s, when I was growing up, being an intelligent, vocal young person was a dangerous thing. So my sister and I always had a very sort of political sense of discrimination, of fairness, and also being a bit outside, being a bit strange and not quite normal. And then I ran away to London to study philosophy. Well before the term employability came into existence, before you had to even think about what you were actually going to do to earn money. But I was a very troubled teenager, and through various therapies, I ended up at the Anna Freud Centre in London. I was 19 and introduced to 5 times a week psychoanalysis, and I was at a real crisis in my life. And it was a complete culture shock. Can you imagine going from pretty much 0 to 5 times a week psychoanalysis? So I tried to stay with it, but found it very difficult. So I ran away. I got my grant check. In those days, you got got a grant to go to university, and I went to America, and I went to, um, again, a very long story, but I went to Canterbury Shaker Village in New England, and looked after the last Shaker, Sister Ethel. And I lived on this museum, Canterbury Shaker Village, and I was sort of obsessed with collective organization and how do people live and how do people make sense of their environment. And also equality, because of course the Shakers were about equality between men and women. And it really started a very long-term love affair with the States, with America. Although, of course, the anti-Americanism is very high now and always was in a way. But my parents were antiques dealers, and when we were 9, we came to America for 6 weeks, and we traveled across California and New York visiting antiques dealers. And we met such exciting people, and it was like a real introduction to how cool America is, how brilliant American stuff is, and just also a really kind of expansive landscape, both intellectually and also politically and just geographically. So I've always had a long-term love of America. My sister, my twin sister, now she's lived in America for many decades, but she now lives in Los Angeles. Writing about art. So again, this has always been a very politicized environment and world that we live in. We're kind of in a state of political catastrophe, but it has always been like this. And in many cases, my experience of living back in the place where I was born in rural Britain is pretty much like the 1970s, because misogyny and inequalities and discrimination, they haven't shifted to a great degree, which is an extraordinary sadness for someone who has been a political activist their whole adult life. I have a real love affair with psychoanalysis. My dad did a PhD in his 40s with Bruno Bettelheim, who wrote The Uses of Enchantment and did a Freudian analysis of children's books. So we always had Freud's books in the house, and they were always on that shelf with the books about sex and Margaret Atwood. So I always felt that Freud was an exciting thinker, and I've maintained my love of psychoanalytic writing because it's brave stuff and it's dangerous stuff. I then moved on to working, again, another long story, but in my late 20s, I became head of education and organising for the Miners International, for a global union federation. And I travelled all over the world running organising projects and campaigns. It was the initial days of cyber campaigning, so using technology to campaign and build solidaristic relationships. And I also spent a lot of time in the former Soviet Union as well. It was always a bizarre thing that my friends used to laugh about, and I used to come up with funny stories about vodka for breakfast in Belarus and stuff. And it was quite funny in a way because it was a really unusual experience. Although in the European Union, there used to be lots of money to pay young people, young activists, to go into the former Soviet Union just to work out what was going on, because no one had had really any sort of in-depth contact. We didn't know this environment. And of course, in the energy sector, the multinational companies were really important and really moving. And it turns out, again, that things come full circle, that the experience of working in Romania and Moldova and Azerbaijan in those years has incredible resonance for the political environment that we're in now around authoritarianism and fascism. Even though it was sort of a strange, big love job, and it was always quite difficult for me to integrate that into coming back to the UK, I think about it every day. I think about those experiences. So then, like most activists, I got completely burnt out after a decade, had a complete emotional and psychological collapse. And like a lot of people who need a lot of therapy, I thought, oh, I know, I'll come back and I'll be a therapist. So I went into training in the Tavistock in that kind of naive, stupid, but well-meaning way that a lot of people enter into training to be a therapist. And of course, I ended up in psychoanalysis and did that not because I wanted to become a psychoanalyst anymore, but because I really needed it. And in the UK, having psychoanalysis is a very, very rare and weird thing to do. It's not available. It costs a lot of money. So again, it was one of those things I didn't really talk about in my working life. So I worked unwaged in the NHS for a number of years as a psychotherapist, but I also became a part-time academic and write about mental health and work. And then in 2011, I was put in a compulsory redundancy pool for the first time in my life. And again, it caused another collapse because I'd been representing workers for decades. And then having to represent myself was, I just couldn't do it. I just didn't have the capacity. And I was really disoriented about that. So I started writing as surviving work, which led to lots of sort of blogs and publications, but also developing a model around surviving work through trades union education methods. And then that led me into a series of research projects around therapeutic labour and around the future of therapy. I then found a home as a sociologist, which in a higher education environment, which isn't massively fond of critical thinking, it feels like quite a delicate place to exist, but it's definitely the place where I exist because it welcomes interdisciplinarity. It welcomes people with a practitioner background like me. So there's huge snobberies, of course, in higher education and in the therapy world. And someone like me with lived experience can be really seriously undervalued within these systems. But sociology does try. It tries to be inclusive in its interdisciplinarity and mix of backgrounds. So it's a place that I feel quite comfortable in. I suppose what really ultimately led to UberTherapy, I mean, this is a book that I feel like as if I've written my whole life because it tries to, like psychoanalysis does, it tries to create the links between these apparently really quite diverse and disconnected things. I appreciate my organizing background because I'm also highly aware that no one reads academic stuff. It's very minimal. How many people will read your academic journal articles, which is kind of heartbreaking. But also, you've got to make it short and cheap and fun because you have a very limited time to hold people's attention. So I write in quite a provocative way, quite a journalistic way. It is an academic book. I think it's important to underpin it with actual facts. But the book is intended to kind of seduce you into thinking about something that's incredibly hard to think about, both in terms of the content of it. I mean, the sheer violence and thuggery that is involved in digital therapy, but also in terms of the attack on thinking that's taking place across all of these domains now. So the book is very much for me an activist book because it's an encouragement to engage with something that you'd really rather walk on by.
What a story. I can kind of hope the next book is a psychobiography or a memoir. Uh, uh, but really, all these roles, like you said,
No.
do all of these roles really do come through in Uber therapy. You're able to write from an activist perspective, a journalistic perspective, a literary perspective, a sociologist perspective, a business perspective. But I want to narrow in on the lived experience piece because you illuminate the dark business network and dark business networks and interests, but you also document in a really sort of provocative and literary way what it feels like when you encounter these apps with the parts of us that are traumatized or the parts of us that we bring to long-term sort of psychotherapy. Um, and you do this through introducing a character that you name Hair and Teeth. It's such a evocative name as well. I wonder if you could just introduce Hair and Teeth to us and tell us about them, and what it was like for you to write about this piece of you, and also what it was like for you to, as a researcher, bring this part of you forward through these different therapy apps.
The first chapter of the book is called Angerland. So I start this book with just an orientation that a lot of us are feeling disoriented and angry in this digital environment, which is really my kickoff point. And I didn't know this when I started writing a book. I mean, it's a genuine book in the sense that I didn't know what the punchline was going to be until I got to the end. So one of the things I didn't know was how much this book was going to be about anger and how much it was going to be about shame. So, because shame is such a difficult word to even say, and it doesn't come up much in conversation because it's so shameful to talk about shame. So the thing that I kept coming back to in my research and experiences of using digital technologies and in a therapeutic way was around the what it feels like and the potential algorithmic harms, which are considerably undermeasured and underestimated for someone like me who has experienced distress and trauma and who's very vulnerable to feeling real deep triggering experiences of shame on a daily basis, which then I call it in the book an algorithmic invitation to self-harm. That's the potential, is that we're not talking about shopping for shoes here. We're talking about hopefully showing the parts of ourselves that we are ashamed to show to another person. And that's where the danger comes in, the potential harm comes in. So hair and teeth, I mean, I'm still nervous about talking about it. I can write about it, but talking about it is quite hard because it's such an unusual thing to do. It's a vehicle to present an argument rather than sort of a testimonial or my story. You don't need to know thank you for asking about my story, but you don't need to know who I am exactly. Because what I'm feeling when I'm using these technologies, I think most people feel, actually. I think a lot of people feel it and just for whatever reason can't relate to another person. And I feel that a lot of the technologies are presented, in a sector of e-commerce online. It all works. Everybody looks happy. Everyone looks better than me. If it works for them, then it should work for me. And then when it doesn't, there's an individualization of an industrial problem. It becomes, I'm the problem, rather than maybe these technologies just aren't good enough, or maybe they're not appropriate for me. So hair and teeth is just a kind of fast-tracked way of sort of trying to bring in a survivor's perspective in a way that is inclusive and just asks, what's the worst that could happen to someone like me? And what would it feel like? And how would I know if it's not right for me? And it's on that really kind of grounded, this is what happens to my body when I'm put in this situation. It's also a feminist perspective as well, because it's still radical to talk about your experience and your feelings and push through the shame of that. And to say how much something hurts and how unfair something is and how that makes you feel, which is constantly being evaded in the AI debates. And as academics, we have a veneer, we have a professional veneer. Some of us choose to take more objective, less subjective standpoints, but actually it's missing the visceral quality of this. Our emotions are in our bodies. So we do have to talk about bodies in the way that we have to talk about sex and we have to talk about money. These are incredibly hard things to talk about. But when we focus on what's happening in our bodies right now, when I use this technology, we come closer to the truth, I think, about what these technologies mean. I also think that it's a good kind of contrast to the sort of advertising side of the business model, but also the black and white thinking that exists in the algorithm, in algorithmic thinking that's part of this digital architecture. Tick boxes, yes/no questionnaires, standardized models. They force you into boxes in a way that hair and teeth pulls you out again and says, no, this is it. This is the experience. My experience cannot be reflected in your online questionnaire. And again, I think it's really important to remind people that we might be measuring the wrong things, which we'll come to a bit later in this interview around datification and performance data, that there is often a kind of evasion of the harms and the real issues around the use of digital technologies. I also think that hair and teeth is a trades union perspective as well as a feminist perspective and a survivor perspective, in that it really prioritizes some practical stuff around how does this harm you in your everyday life? What does this do to you? What does it stop you doing? What's the worst it can do to you? And in my work and in the book, I talk a lot about this idea of an AI mental health and safety. So trades unions it might sound a bit boring, but increasingly absolutely life-saving. Health and safety is really important kind of framework to understand how would you use these tools, because actually we can't get away from digitalization and AI technologies. They're here to stay. We have to understand them, but we also have to learn how to use them safely. So just from a sort of an experiential pedagogy, trades unions, I come from that background of trades union education, which says, let's analyze your experience, let's pull out the risks, and let's try and introduce some principles and practices of health and safety. So that's the sort of palatable part of hair and teeth, which is to say, okay, so how am I going to make this hurt less? How am I going to be healthier and safer in this environment that I find myself in?
For our listeners who haven't read the book yet, you introduce hair and teeth to a number of different types of digital therapeutics. And you talked just now about like the way that shame gets brought up in these interactions. Particularly if you feel like it's not working for me, it's working for other people, and now the industrial problem gets individualized. I wonder if you could share one of the stories from the book about just encountering one of these, without, you don't have to use the name in particular, but one of the names from the book, one of these styles of AI therapeutics or digital therapeutics, and then and what it felt like to interact with it as hair and teeth.
Oh gosh, that's funny. That's quite a difficult question for me to answer because particularly where I was using online therapy platforms, I was dealing with real human being therapists, and so I had a lot of supervision and therapy of my own where I had to sort of think about the ethical parameters of that as somebody who wasn't using these services just as a service user. I think the thing that came up in my interactions with actual human beings within these digital systems was just how incredibly difficult it was for me to reach that person and to see that person as a potential ally through all of the architecture. Missed calls, cameras not working, only having 6 sessions. I mean, it just seems almost remarkable to me. I'm not wishing to denigrate the women. They were women that I interacted with through digital therapy. I thought they were great and I thought they did what they could do. But actually, the amount of hoops you have to jump through just to get to the point of being in a safe space, I never even got off the starting blocks. I know I'm unusual because I have a memory of 5 times a week psychoanalysis, so that's not going to be replicated in the digital sphere. But I'm quite good at being able to establish a rapport with somebody and get a sense of whether I like them or trust them. But I found that almost impossible. I felt disoriented the whole time. And that pushed me back into my most paranoid, hostile, reactive self, which hair and teeth also is, quite angry. I found myself being apoplectic with rage. I found myself checking my credit card that this wasn't financial fraud. It all felt so, because all of these systems require you to give so much financial and personal information. You're suddenly left hanging, before you even get to have contact with somebody. So my story of my experience really is quite grim from the get-go. I mean, it gets slightly more funny when I'm involved in a chatbot. I start off with the premise, I'm having too good a time in my sex life. I'm just too good at sex. I'm far too attractive, which I assume is a problem that has never come up really, or at least very rarely comes up in therapy. But I found that in a way, the thing that troubled me the most was the system actually really did everything that it could for me to prevent me from feeling like as if I had a safe, caring, empathic interaction. I didn't once even hit upon that. So it felt like hostile terrain for me.
Yeah, it's like reaching and reaching and trying to see, is this a real, can I get to a real person? Can I get to a real connection? And finding all of these sort of evasions and obstacles.
Yeah, and I felt really miserable. I felt really ashamed. Yeah, I felt really anxious, made me much more anxious. I think The thing about hair and teeth is that it represents a part of me that I had to work very hard to sit alongside, in therapy. And I sit alongside it. I don't like it. I feel as if I'm an absolute newbie to self-worth. Self-confidence and self-worth have come late to me in life. And I felt all of that work being eroded by the same old, traumatic PTSD issues coming up. They were really triggered in this process. And it made me really angry because for me, in psychotherapy or therapy, the North Star of therapy is I can show myself as I really am to another person. That's so powerful, isn't it? And it's so rare. And that took me a lifetime to come feel safe enough to be able to show myself, that I felt myself really hurtling backwards. And it felt really just incredibly sad for me that if that was your first experience of therapy, what would that feel like? What would that tell you about yourself? It was such a huge fight for me to get a basic level of acceptance. It makes me angry that somebody would be thrown off course by something that really didn't work.
You mentioned that the individual therapists working in these systems might have been doing what they could, but that the system, as it's come to exist, really prevented like an actual connection or safety from being formed that would allow for these kinds of experiences of self-revelation to self and other. So maybe we zoom out here to this, put the sociologist piece of it in here. Can you walk us through how these systems have come to be, how austerity and neoliberalism have really set the stage for then venture capital to come in to the therapy space and begin what you call these processes of extraction and enshittification, which I think really does some evocative work to
Now,
explain what it.
you've said it.
Yeah.
So I talk a lot in the book about shit. So we we could spend the next half an hour talking about shit if you wanted to.
How did digital therapy get so shitty and shittified?
It's a bold claim, but I do also accept the theory of enshittification around digitalization and platformization. So let me introduce Uberization or UberTherapy to you. So this is a book that offers an industrial relations perspective. Okay, in first and foremost, that's what's distinct about the book, is it's talking about the profession and the practice of therapy from an industrial perspective, which is quite unusual in and of itself. But with the process which exists in every sector and which is only now really being visible in the professions, that's the moment that we've hit, is Uberization. The book is looking at the business models, and there are multiple business models, and they are fluid and they are changing all the time in terms of working out how to extract stuff from us, data, money, information. But it's looking at the business models that are coming out of these processes of digitalization, of platformization, so the emergence of these platforms. And I'll come back to the multiple meanings of platforms, datafication, so just the huge extraction and value of data that has emerged, and appification, how we do things through our mobile phones and through apps, and the implications for therapists and the consumers of therapy. And it's in the words there that we're now talking also about consumers of therapy. So it's about the emergence of therapy as a sector of e-commerce. You can buy it business to business or business to consumer. In industrial terms, we're at this, very exciting moment of regulation and also management and understanding of platforms. That's a big industry in and of its own right. And internationally and nationally, we're all trying to work out how to regulate digital companies. We're all trying to work out how to regulate platformization of work, gig economy. So there's this huge kind of body of work going on around automation, for example, surveillance, datafication, bias and inequalities in all of that datafication, and so regulation. So we're in that world now where we are obsessed by this Uberization process from lots of different perspectives. What's quite new is that we're not just talking about Amazon workers or Uber drivers. We are actually talking about the professions which have quietly been Uberized over the last 10 years. We're about 5 to 10 years behind the US here in the UK when it comes to the platformization of therapy, but we're heading in your direction very clearly. But one of the things that I notice about lots of professions, lawyers, journalists, academics, writers, denial that exists around what's happening. So we're at a moment where if you're in private practice as a psychoanalyst, you may not genuinely think that UberTherapy is anything to do with you. And the big sort of take home from the book is, oh, yes, it is. It is now. This is your world. You have no choice but to understand it and also prepare yourself for what is happening within your profession. So the line of argument in UberTherapy is firstly, Uberization is taking place in a profession near you. So it is, we have seen the rapid emergence of manualized and digitalized models of therapy. We're seeing increased use of AI technologies, whether they're visible or not. It's almost impossible to imagine a process within therapy now that doesn't somehow touch on AI technologies. Issues around automation, datafication, performance management, how we assess recovery, for example, our own performance, how we justify that to insurance companies. And this is right across the public and private systems. The question I ask in the book is, this model is sold as a convenient fact of life. You know, it is what it is. This is where the business is heading. But it asks the question, what's the cost of that? So included in the book is just some information about the digital therapy project, which I run with Linda Michaels from Cyan, Psychotherapy Action Network, who I think you're going to be interviewing soon, who is literally one of my heroes, very famously sued by Talkspace for $40 million for asking if this is therapy. Of course, it's a really complex and interesting story, the American setting, and I have learnt more from her co-edited book about future generations than any other book. So when I talk to UK therapists, I just say, read Linda's book. If you want to know what's happening, it's there. They've done the work. If they can tell you exactly what's happening, don't ignore it. But we did a survey of 500 UK and 500 US therapists about their experiences of using digital therapy. And it was incredibly hard to even ask a question correctly because of the issues around AI literacy and people's cognizance of what technologies they're already using. So we asked a question, do you work for an online therapy platform, which in the UK, it flatlined. People didn't even understand what we were talking about. Even if they were working for BetterHelp, they still weren't quite sure of the terminology. So we're at very early stages of really understanding what technologies we're already using. But the take home from that survey, which will be published, I hope this year, is that everybody understands the convenience of it, but at what cost? And one of the key conveniences is actually that in the UK, a session with BetterHelp is around £45. The rate is set so that it's cheap enough for you not to worry about having to spend the day on the phone to your private medical insurance company, both for you and your therapist. And that's the business model. It's not very sophisticated. But of course, the additional cost to the therapist is about this lack of transparency about what somebody pays and what you get paid, the sort of pyramid scales of pricing. And also the fact that certainly in the UK, what it has introduced is an industry standard of around £40 an hour, which is about half of what it used to be before COVID. I mean, this is traditional industrial relations stuff. You've got a company like Amazon, you're going to depress wages by 50% at some point. And then round the corner is this issue of dynamic pricing. So having these different scales and tiers of workers and pay scales that no one that is algorithmically determined and no one can challenge. So that's a big part of the book, is the cost of that is very heavily financial for the therapist. This is not a sustainable form of work for therapists. The other thing that, of course, the other key cost in therapists, I love doing surveys, open comment boxes on surveys with therapists, because you just get some dynamite in there. Therapists are very good at, in 2 sentences, really going for the jugular. So you always get great quotes, but really it's around depth therapy. The loss is around depth. How deep can you go? How much of a relationship can you form? And one of the respondents introduced this phrase into my working and Linda's working, which is around defenses against thinking. So one of the big theses around the book is that this business model introduces on multiple layers a defense against thinking. Okay, so we can come back to it, but it's an attack on thinking. You don't understand the system, you don't see it, you don't know where it's taking you, you don't know how much you're paying, you don't know how much somebody's received. It stops you, it disorientates you, and it stops you thinking, and it certainly stops you thinking critically about it. But I also argue in the book that it's a defense against dependency. So that's another attack on depth work, is how could you become dependent upon someone who's working in a system that is fundamentally unreliable and unsustainable for both of you? And in the book, I use the phrase therapeutic Tinder. So in the book, interestingly, I don't use any actual company names apart from Tinder, but that somehow got through the lawyers. But anyway, no one's told me to stop using it, so I use it. A bit of a provocation, but about what it means to be in this sector of e-commerce, of being able to swipe, of being able to choose from a smorgasbord of therapists, and if you don't like them, move on. And in the early days of online therapy platforms, it would literally be part of their advertising. No need to become dependent on a therapist. If you don't like them, we'll find you another one. That was an offering. I look back at the adverts from 5 years ago, and you don't see them anymore. Now it's all green pages and sort of healthy sustainability kind of imagery. But in the early days, they'd literally say, this is cheap, this is fast, you don't have to be dependent. So the business model was much clearer in those early days if you were keeping your eyes out. So I also, in the book, talk about therapy as a model of retail therapy. So what does it mean to be able to buy and to swipe and to rank and rate? And again, the sort of the shaming and the blaming that's involved in that, both of the individual client who isn't able to get what they want again, and who keeps spending money to make themselves feel better. But it really sort of comes into this argument, which I think is much more visible in the States, of bad therapy is about being a bad patient and being a bad therapist, that it, again, it individualizes a problem about a business model. I don't advise therapists to do this, but if you go onto Reddit and look at bad therapy, you'll see lots of therapists being named on there. And again, it's a very easy skip and a hop, because BetterHelp doesn't actually employ anybody. These are all self-employed workers. It's like ranking and rating your Uber driver. It's a place to do a dump and run. So coming back to shit, it's sort of, there is an enshittification, there is a degradation, both of the work of the therapist and also what the consumer has a right to consume, has a right to demand. I want to go back a bit to this idea of enshittification, because although I find it quite fun, in a puerile way, I do find it quite funny. It is quite an important part of the argument, is that the degradation, the shittiness of this situation is projected into the individuals involved on both sides of the therapeutic relationship, which should be a call to arms. We're being had here. you know, because it's an evasion of business responsibilities, of corporate responsibilities. And we are seeing this much more around the regulation of chatbots, around young people's mental health, around the emerging cases of suicide and negligence that happen in these systems, issues around safeguarding. So this will come and it will be lived out in court. But actually, what's really important in the book, I call it sabor a mierda. We've got this sense in us that something's a bit off about this. And so in the book, I invite people to use hair and teeth, to use this gut feeling that this isn't quite right, and use it as a way of determining what is harmful and what is not. Because again, these legal cases will live out. The States leads the way, but the UK is following right behind you. But actually, it's important that we preempt this, is that we develop a critical sense of what's shit and what isn't shit, and what's right for us and what isn't. And we use that to be more discerning about where we place ourselves in this landscape.
It strikes me that in the book you talk about at least two ways in which the enshittification rolls downhill, right? Like that there's the business sense that these are individual consumers and individual practitioners who are 1099 workers or independent contractors. And so if you have a bad experience, it's a bad therapist who can either be, you can fire and pick somebody new, or they can be sort of made marginal by the algorithm in some way, so they match less frequently or something like that. But there's also the sort of like psychological, psychoanalytic interpretation that you offer of the way that shit gets projected because of the business system, and that allows us to avoid rupture and repair work in therapy, and that allows us to. So I'm wondering if could you say more about the sort of like psychological shit that's getting thrown around because of the model and the way that it frames and does not frame the therapy relationship.
It projects the problem into the individual. And it's both in terms of where the blame is and where the resolution to that is. And it completely disempowers the individual to be able to do anything about it. Obviously, as a trade unionist, I say there's also an individualizing issue here, which is it stops us thinking about it collectively. And I think that's one of the really sort of challenging things about going onto Reddit or chat rooms and looking at the bad therapy debates that are there. You're forced to go on social media to do the shaming and blaming and naming and to have a conversation about it. So, I mean, one of the sort of future areas of work that I'm really interested in developing is around a digital therapy kite mark and around consumer actions. Is that if we're going to have a conversation about this, if we're going to resolve this, we have to do it collectively. We can't just leave it to who shouts the loudest and who says the meanest stuff, and also who takes the legal cases, because of course that is it's hard to be in court, and that's a whole story in and of itself. So I think that it sort of leaves you no place to go, and it leaves into a further withdrawal from other people. And another sort of thesis of the book is that we have to relearn, come back into contact with, re-experience that other people are not a waste of time. And I mean, I don't have a silver bullet for that or a magic solution, but if I don't see how as an individual I can think my way out of this. This isn't about clever stuff. It's not about me being better or me being tougher or more resilient. It's not those things. It's about managing somehow to create a safe environment where we collectively can put pressure, do some pushback. Now, these companies are enormous and they will exist for as long as they choose to exist. But certainly within the therapeutic profession, for example, within our professional bodies, within our networks, within progressive networks like Cyan, we have a job to do, which is firstly to become literate in this, to understand it, not be defended about the landscape that we're now working in, and start to develop some principles and practices that we think could form the basis of regulation. We have to engage with it, I think, really on a collective basis. And I think the same is true for consumers as well. In many ways, I think that consumers will have more traction in this business model and also probably more fun and more success in helping to redesign the sector and to reorganize the sector and to play around with who are the key actors in that sector. I don't have a simple kind of response to it. We can come back to in chapter 6, I talk about this idea of real therapy and much better help, what that would look like. And I frame it as intentionality within the book because I don't have a sort of how-to guide. And I'm also aware that people are really tired and burnt out and frightened at the moment. So I think in many ways, finding spaces where you can say what you think and what is on your mind is a rare and precious thing. So if you find that space, stay in that space. And if you find yourself in an allegedly therapeutic space which does not allow you to say what's on your mind, then leave it. That's my, people often ask me, what can I tell my kid? What can I tell my teenager? And I'm just like, look, if it feels like someone's telling you to shut up, go, leave. That cannot possibly be a good thing. It's on that very simple sort of intentionality, but also intuition level that we have to navigate this on a daily basis.
That concludes part 1 of our Mad in America podcast with Elizabeth Cotton on UberTherapy. Thanks for listening. In part 2, Elizabeth and I are going to zoom out and look at the system behind all of this. We talk about why platforms keep offering the same short-term standardized form of therapy and how data and performance metrics shape what counts as help in these platforms. We're also going to look at what it's like for therapists inside these models and ultimately what gets lost when care is built around avoiding dependence and avoiding each other. So please join us for part 2, the next part of this podcast. Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.